6. Brian.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming tonight. I would like to welcome you to Jersey City and Jersey City Theater Center. My name is Newman. I'm executive producer of this company and also founder. And I would like to first say thank you so much for all the sponsors, because we have a lot of people involved in the exhibitions and partnerships. So I would like to thank Catalan Education. Please give a round of applause to the Catalan Education Institute, Ramadou. Please, thank you so much. And also Catalan Institute of America, right? So thank you so much. Also on Jersey City and County side, I would like to thank New Jersey Council on the Arts for supporting Jersey City Theater Center and Hudson County Cultural Affairs, and also City of Jersey City Cultural Affairs, and of course people of Jersey City for supporting arts by voting on Arts Fund last year. And it is my great pleasure to introduce artists who flew all the way from Barcelona. Espe, thank you so much. I also, Teresa, and of course our own Live Isabel live here, yes, somewhere. And everyone who works on board and staff at Jersey City Theater Center. It's been very busy week, so thank you guys. Thank you for all the hard work you're doing. And I just would like to take a couple of seconds. I was born in Kiev, Ukraine, and if we could take just a couple of seconds of silence, because today more than ever, cultural exchange and understanding is so important. And I believe that what artists are thinking by crossing ocean are important messages of peace and mutual understanding. So thank you, and if you can just take a couple of seconds thinking of people and artists of Ukraine. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce my partner now and president of SANT JORDI USA, Newman. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's particularly significant, I think, after all this moment of silence for Ukraine, to recognize what brings us these two exhibitions together. I'm sorry. Espe Pons got in touch with me, I'm not even sure how, in order to because she wanted to show, she was very eager to show this show in New York and New Jersey, in the tri-state area. And so of course it's an incredibly compelling exhibition about the Civil War. And then Teresa Tuliera, I met through translation, and she has an extraordinary exhibition how do you know when a war ends? And these two exhibitions are about the unending trauma of war. The Civil War was 8 years ago. The Balkan War was 30 years ago, and we still have to talk about it, and people are still suffering the effects. So those are my thoughts. And I too am absolutely grateful to the delegation of Catalonia to the United States for supporting this project, and to the Institute of Youth for bringing the artists, and to Amazon Crossing for also contributing to the costs of everything we've done. But above all, I'm grateful to Olga Levina for giving us a home and giving us a place where all of this would happen, because without the Jersey City Theater Center, none of us would be here. So it's my great, great pleasure to present Espe Pons, who will tell us about this the story of this incredible exhibition. And thank you for coming.
Good afternoon to all of you. Please excuse me, my English is not that fluent.
I prefereixo fer la presentació del meu treball, em sento més tranquil·la i més segura amb la línia que m'ajudaran a traduir.
And I prefer to present my work. I feel more sure of myself with the help of Daniel, who will help me translate.
Torno a donar les gràcies a la Olga i a la Marianne. Sense elles no estaríem aquí avui. Han estat...
I'd like to thank once again thank Olga and Marianne, without whom we wouldn't be here today.
Han estat molts mesos de conversa i jo crec que al final el que ens reuneix a tots és aquest sentiment que estem fent alguna cosa.
We've been engaged in talks for many months, and I think what joins us all is the feeling that we're doing something worthwhile.
Em dic Espe Pons, soc fotògrafa de Barcelona.
My name is Espe Pons. I'm a photographer from Barcelona.
Fa més de 20 anys que em dedico a exposar la meva obra a nivell nacional i internacional.
I've been exhibiting my work for more than 20 years, nationally and internationally.
El nucli fonamental del meu treball sempre és la memòria i el paisatge.
The kernel of the fundamental core of my work has always been landscape and memory.
L'any 2019 decideixo fer 2018-2019 per un treball sobre paisatge i memòria històrica.
In 2018, 2019, I began to prepare a work of mine on historic landscape.
Arrenco unes cartes que la mare tenia a casa.
Based on some letters that my mom had at home.
Eren del Tomás Pons Albesa, el germà petit de meu pare.
From Tomás Pons Albesa, who was the smallest, youngest brother of my grandfather.
Eren cartes que ell va enviar des de la presó de la Model de Barcelona.
These were letters that he had sent from the Model jail in Barcelona.
El treball comença quan, a través d'aquestes cartes, decideixo fer una recerca.
My work began when, through these letters, I decided to do some research.
I busco informació del Tomàs a través d'arxius nacionals i catalans.
And I sought out information on Tomás through national and Catalan archives.
El Tomàs el van afusellar al camp de la Bota amb 31 anys.
Tomás was 31 when he was shot at the Camp de la Bota. The title of the exhibit, Under the Light of the Sea, is a reference to the place where he was shot in Camp de la Bota,
on van afusellar el Tomàs amb 30 anys.
where Thomas was shot when he was 31.
El Camp de la Bota està situat a Barcelona.
Camp de la Bota is located in Barcelona.
Hi havia una paret
There was a parapet, there was a wall
on es va afusellar molta gent durant la guerra i la guerra civil espanyola.
where many people were shot to death during the Spanish Civil War and after the Spanish Civil War.
Amb la reestructuració urbanística de l'any 92,
With the urban renewal that took place in 1992,
aquesta paret va quedar sota del mar.
this wall ended up under sea level, below sea level.
Per això aquest títol, perquè jo el que vull fer és donar llum a sota la llum del mar.
That's why, hence the title for this exhibit, because what I want to do is shed light on what is underneath the light of the sea.
Si us sembla, faré un petit recorregut visual explicant-vos una mica les imatges des d'aquí asseguts que us vaig explicar.
If you have no objection, what I'd like to do is do a brief tour of the various images on the wall while you're seated, and I'll give you a brief overview.
Comentar-vos que el treball que l'acompanya en dos textos.
I should point out that my work has, the photos are accompanied by two texts.
Un text que és de Vicent Altalló, escriptor, poeta i persona molt coneguda en l'àmbit català cultural.
One text is by Vicent Altalló, who is a writer and a poet, and someone who is quite well known in cultural circles.
I l'altre text és de Llum, que és conservadora de l'arxiu del photographic a l'Espe Pons.
And the other text is by Llum, who is the curator at the ICP in New York in the Robert Capa photo archive.
Bé, el treball comença amb aquest vídeo que podeu veure que és el vídeo del Camp de la Bota. És un vídeo que jo he fet.
My work started with this video, which you can see, which is a video from the Camp de la Bota. I shot it.
El Camp de la Bota és el mar invertit.
So here we can see an inverted image of the sea.
Perquè el que vull, insisteixo, és donar llum a aquests fets que van passar sota la llum del mar.
Because, again, I insist that what I'm trying to do, I emphasize that what I'm trying to do is shed light on what happened underneath the light of the sea.
Conceptualment, el que faig és pujar al mar per donar llum a aquests fets.
Però conceptualment,
El que faig és invertir, pujar al mar a dalt per donar llum a aquests fets.
so conceptually what I'm doing is lifting the sea, invert the image to shed light on these facts, on these occurrences.
El Tomàs el van afusellar amb 31 anys al Camp de la Bota.
Tomás was shot when he was 31 at the Camp de la Bota.
He de dir que no és un treball bibliogràfic del Tomàs.
I should say that this is not a biographical work on Tomás's life,
Ni tampoc és un treball fotoperiodístic.
and it's not a work of photojournalism either.
Per mi és un treball on les imatges parlen a través del seu silenci.
This is a work where the images speak through their silence.
El primer que faig és situar la gent en aquesta Espanya de guerra civil.
The first thing I did was to situate people in this context of Spain in the midst of the Civil War.
El treball consta de 32 imatges,
There are 41 images in this work,
però he adaptat, he fet un petit resum per aquesta
but I adapted the work, summarizing it and making it fit the size of this hall.
La primera imatge que veieu
The first image you can see
és l'església Sant Felip Neri de Barcelona,
is from the Sant Felip Neri Church in Barcelona,
on podeu veure els vestigis dels italians,
where you can see the remains of the bombing from the Italian aircraft.
a la ciutat de Barcelona.
Not in Barcelona.
La següent imatge és un camí d'un poble a la vora de la Saragossa que es diu Rodeo.
The second image is from a trail in a town next to Zaragoza called Bota.
Rodeo és un poble on hi ha una part antiga
Bota has an old border
i hi ha tots els vestigis de la guerra civil espanyola.
where you can see many remains of the Spanish Civil War.
El Tomàs era secretari general del Suport Roig Internacional.
Tomás was the General Secretary of the International Red Aid Group, Support Roig Internacional,
I era membre de la
and he was a member of the Unified Socialist Party of Catalunya, the SUC.
ell va anar a la guerra, va anar a front, a Madrid, a Terol, i és per això que fotografio també aquests paisatges.
He fought in the Spanish Civil War on the front near Madrid at Terol. That's why I shot all these landscapes.
Com us he comentat, és un país de resum, hi ha més imatges, i per això
As I mentioned, this is just a summary. There are more images. I'll go quickly.
aquesta imatge gran
This large image here
és el refugi 307
is Refuge or Shelter 307
de Barcelona,
in Barcelona,
on la gent es refugiava de les bombardejos.
where people took refuge from the bottom, from their airstrikes.
Per mi és molt important explicar-vos que és un treball absolutament crític amb allò que va passar.
It's very important for me to explain to you that this is extremely critical. My work is extremely critical of what happened.
És per això que la mirada és una mirada molt frontal, molt directa.
That's why my gaze is quite straight on and very direct.
Al febrer del 1990,
In February of 1940,
després de mesos que la policia estava investigant aquest grup del SUC,
after months during which a month of investigation by the police of this group I mentioned from the Unified Socialist Party of Catalunya,
la policia detén 52 persones membres del SUC.
the police arrested 52 members of the SUC,
Entre elles el Tomàs, la Teresa Hernández, la Isabel
among whom were Tomás, Teresa Hernández, and Isabel Vicente.
La fotografia que tenim darrere de les escales
The photo that you see behind us of the staircase
pertany a Via La Gitana, la comissaria de policia.
is to be found in the police precinct of Anguilla in Barcelona.
Tots els espais que són interiors, jo he demanat permís per poder entrar i fotografiar.
I requested permission to take pictures of all the interior spaces here.
En el moment de la recerca, aquests mesos que faig previs abans de fotografiar els paisatges,
While doing the research, in the moments of preparation before I actually take pictures of the landscape.
Trobo que la Teresa Hernández i la seva llegenda es van fer grans en sobreviure en diferents ocasions.
I discovered that Teresa Hernandez and Isabel Vicente grew up. They actually managed to survive their prison experience.
I van escriure les seves biografies.
And they wrote biographies.
I van escriure que el dia que els van fer la detenció van veure el Tomàs pujar les escales.
And they wrote that on the day of their arrest, they saw Tomás going up the stairs
El seu propi peu
on his own.
I baixar arrossegant-se del seu món.
And they saw him come down, dragging himself, bloody.
Quan jo vaig veure aquestes escales vaig fer una evocació de la història que havia escrit la Teresa.
When I saw these stairs, I evoked to myself the narrative of Teresa and Isabel.
És per això que, per més la filla extrema que està per la fotografia d'aquestes escales, és la solitud, la necessitat extrema d'aquest.
That's why this represents the extreme solitude of everything that happened.
Després de la comissaria,
After the police headquarters,
són traslladats a la presó de Model de la ciutat de Barcelona.
they were transferred to the Model jail in the city of Barcelona.
Gràcies a l'Arxiu Nacional de Catalunya,
Thanks to the Catalan National Archive,
sé que el Tomàs està a la cel·la 447 que tenim aquí.
I know that Thomas was housed in cell 447, which you can see behind me.
I fotografio els espais de la presó. La següent,
And I shot various pictures inside the jail.
la següent imatge també és el pati de la Model.
And in the next image, you can see the patio in the Model prison.
El treball al començo presenta l'any 2019 en diferents llocs espanyols i catalans.
I began to show my work in 2019 in various locations, both in Catalonia and throughout Spain.
Madrid, Tenerife, Barcelona.
I had exhibits in Madrid, Tenerife, and Barcelona.
I voldria destacar diferents llocs com Foto Espanya, Madrid,
And I would highlight some different places like Photo España in Madrid,
Fundació Vilacasas, que tenim a Madrid,
the Villa Casas Foundation in Rio in Madrid.
Belgrado, Fotomón, Festival.
I showed this in Belgrade at the Photo Mom Festival.
I molts més que no vull deixar ningú.
And a lot more, and I don't want to leave any out.
El 2021 decideixo fer una publicació, una publicació d'aquest treball.
In 2021, I decided to self-publish my work.
És aquest contingut
This photo book is the result.
que també trobareu aquí a l'entrada de l'estació.
Which you can find here at the entrance to the hall.
Les frases que teniu aquí a l'entrada,
The phrases which are inscribed in a mirror
les he combinat en català i en anglès
are in Catalan and English
perquè és el Festival de Sant Jordi
because we are here for the SANT JORDI festival
a Nova York.
in New York.
La primera frase, la fotografia necessita de la llum.
The first sentence, photography needs light,
La història també necessita de la veritat.
and history also needs truth.
És una frase que està dins del llibre del treball, és una frase de Vicent Anterior.
May be found in the book. It is a quote from Vicent Altayo's piece in the book.
Les dues frases del mig són de la Sílvia i Llum, una en anglès i una en català.
The two sentences in the middle, one in English, one in Catalan, are from Cynthia Young.
L'última és de Vicenç també.
And the last two sentences are from Vicente also.
Si seguim amb la sèrie, amb el recorregut visual,
If we continue this visual tour in the back,
les dues següents imatges
the next two images
són de l'Arxiu Tribunal Militar de la Ciutat de Barcelona.
are from the 3rd Military Tribunal of Barcelona.
Quan demano informació via telefònica i via mail,
When I sent emails to the guy on the phone to ask for information,
sobre Tomás Pons,
I'm Tomás Pons,
em diuen que han trobat informació i que es puc anar a l'arxiu
I was told that they had found information and that I could go to the archive.
i em donen aquesta segona imatge, aquest feix de papers.
And if you look at the second image on the left, I was handed that sheet of that pile of papers.
Per sorpresa meva, pregunto al senyor de l'arxiu
To my surprise, I asked the guy at the archive
si tot això és del Tomàs.
if all of that was from Tomás.
I em diuen que no.
And he said no.
És del sumaríssim de guerra,
He said it was the proceedings from the court martials
de les 52 persones que detenen.
of the 52 people who were arrested.
La foto de l'esquerra són els noms.
On the left, you can see a listing of the names.
Al número 30 hi trobareu el Tomàs.
Thomas's name is number, is number 30.
Les dues últimes imatges
The last two images
pertanyen al final de la carretera.
are part of the Sota de la Pedrera,
És una foto comuna al cementiri de Montjuïc de Barcelona.
which is a mass grave in the Montjuïc Cemetery in Barcelona,
On hi ha més de 1.700 morts.
where there are more than 1,700 bodies.
Sabem pels veïns que els cossos afusellats
We know through testimony given by the neighbors there that the bodies of the people who were shot
arribaven en camions
were transported there by truck,
que des de dalt llançaven els cossos afusellats.
and they threw the bodies from up on top into the grave.
Per la documentació sé que el Tomàs els cossos estaven.
I know from documentation that his body is to be found there.
L'última imatge és molt significativa.
The final image is quite meaningful.
És el vol dels ocells, aquesta imatge que el que pretén és donar la llibertat a totes aquestes persones que es van
And the purpose, this photo shows birds in flight, and the meaning of this is it's an attempt to give back liberty to all those from whom liberty was stolen.
Hi ha moltes més imatges
There are many more images
que podeu trobar en el llibre. És un llibre que l'any passat va guanyar un premi.
which you can find in the book. The book actually received an award last year,
Un premi a una fira internacional de la llibre de cançó.
at an international book fair on artistic books.
M'interessa sobretot com els paisatges acumulen aquestes capes de memòria.
What really interests me is how landscapes accumulate these layers of memory.
Conceptualment, trobareu el mar una altra vegada.
Conceptually, you'll see once again that the sea is on top.
no us explicaré foto per foto,
I'm not going to go through a photo by photo explanation of this,
però us puc explicar que és un llibre que necessita ser mirat
but I can tell you that this is a book that you have to look at
lentament
slowly.
i també quan hi ha interiors el que fem un despegat.
And when there are interior shots, we do a sort of fold out,
Ens ajuda també a fer una mirada lenta i anar a poc amb el treball i anar agraint.
which allows us to look at this very gradually and move forward slowly as we digest the experience.
Una de les imatges que també són importants
One of the important images
són aquestes 4 cantonades de la cel·la de Tomàs.
are these 4 corners of Thomas's cell.
La meva idea era fotografiar les cantonades
My idea was to shoot the corners
perquè la gent pugui sentir-se totalment tancada en un espai com és una cel·la.
for people to have the experience of feeling themselves totally confined in a closed space, such as is a cell, jail cell.
Sé que és un treball dur visualment,
I know that this is visually tough,
però crec que és necessari i que la gent entengui la duresa del treball.
but I think it's necessary for people to understand the harshness of this work.
Només trobarem una imatge de Tomàs
There's only one image of Thomas himself,
i no dic qui és el Tomàs.
and I'm not saying who Thomas is.
Aquí està un grup d'amics i la seva germana Teresa al barri de la Barcelona. Al barri de la Barcelona.
And here you can see him with some of his friends and his sister Teresa in the Barceloneta neighborhood.
Perquè m'interessa que la gent arribi fins al final
Because what I want is people to make it to the end,
i probablement arribi al Tomàs.
and they can find Thomas here.
Tota l'estona és una lectura lenta i d'anar investigant.
This is a period of slow reading and investigation.
Al final trobareu
At the end, you'll find
els textos de la Cíntia i el Vicenç
the text by Cynthia and Vicens
en català, castellà i anglès
in Catalan, Spanish, and English,
i per ordre d'aparició les localitzacions dels paisatges.
and a list of the locations of the landscapes in the order that they appear.
Per mi ha sigut un treball que m'ha donat moltes satisfaccions, a nivell personal i professional.
This was a work that got me a lot of personal and professional satisfaction.
I crec que està tenint un bon recorregut professionalment.
I think that professionally it's had a good track record so far.
La prova és que estem aquí avui.
And proof of that is the fact that we're here tonight.
Crec que no vaig conèixer el Tomàs, evidentment,
Obviously, I never met Tomás,
però crec que va ser una persona entranyable per totes les cartes que vaig trobar.
but based on all the letters of his that I found, I think he must have been quite someone.
El Tomàs treballava de comercial en una farmàcia a Barcelona
He worked in sales in a drugstore in Barcelona,
i ajudava, tenia relació amb metges i farmacèutics.
and he helped out. He had relations with doctors and pharmacists.
Crec personalment que no va fer res,
Personally, I think he did nothing wrong.
sinó creure en els seus ideals polítics.
He just believed in his political ideals,
I per això va funcionar.
and that's why it was shot.
La Cynthia Llum, el text de la Cynthia Llum és un text més curt que el Vicenç.
Cynthia Young's text is shorter than Vicence's text.
És un text, tots dos són importants per mi.
Both texts are important for me.
El fet que l'Espe recolzés o la Cynthia Llum li agradés aquest treball, per mi va ser anímicament una pujada professional.
The fact that the ICP would support this and that Cynthia Young enjoyed my work gave me a big morale boost.
Ella explica, podreu, si adquiriu el llibre o quan veieu el text, però ella explica que
If you get the book later and you look at the text, you'll see that she explains that
el Robert Capa, quan fotografiava la Guerra Civil Espanyola,
when Robert Capa used to photograph the Spanish Civil War,
ell sabia els noms de les persones que estaven fotografiant.
he knew the names of the people he was taking pictures of.
Però sovint la premsa no posava els peus de foto, els noms d'aquestes persones.
But often there was no identification of these people in the press.
En el cas del Tomàs, ella diu que no podem, que jo d'alguna manera el que pretenc és no perdre la vista del passat.
And she says that with respect to Tomás, what I'm trying to do is not to lose sight of the past.
Perquè el Tomàs està identificat.
Because Tomás is identified.
Crec que m'agradaria no allargar-me molt per si em podeu fer preguntes i poder intervenir tots.
I don't want to go on too long in case any of you have any questions, and I'd like to give all of you the opportunity to speak.
Like you have to go and speak into the mic because it's live streamed. So if you have a question, no, you have a question.
First of all, this is incredibly powerful and moving. It seems that if you were to give a genre, it would be about photographs of conscience. Does that make sense to you when you see this represented in other places around the world today where there's conflict?
Photographs of conscience, you said that. En primer lloc, he de dir que això realment comou molt i jo crec que això es podria classificar com fotografies de la consciència. I demano si aquesta classificació té sentit per vostè i si vostè ha vist algun altre indret del món on el conflicte hagi estat representat de forma semblant. Well, first of all, thank you for that time.
No sé si hi ha moments que hagi fotografiat paratges semblants.
I don't know if there's anyone else who has taken photos of similar landscapes.
Jo penso que totes les mirades dels fotògrafs sempre són diferents, encara que treballin en el mateix tema.
I think that all gazes, photographic gazes, are different, even if two photographers are working on the same subject.
La sensibilitat del fotògraf està darrere de la càmera.
A photographer's sensitivity may be found behind the lens.
I la plasma en la fotografia tècnicament com faci aquesta imatge.
And they express it technically through their photography.
Per desgràcia, actualment tenim la guerra d'Ucraïna.
Unfortunately, we now have the war in Ukraine.
I crec que les meves imatges són atemporals.
And I think my imagery is atemporal.
Tant pel lloc com
say that with reference not only to the place, but to the time.
Que és per això també la meva implicació en aquest festival i per la situació personal de l'obra també m'he implicat també.
And it's also because of that my involvement in this festival, and because of Olga's own personal situation, I myself got more involved.
No sé si he respost a la
I don't know if I responded to your question.
We were wondering if we could turn off the light for a minute so we could actually really see the image on the wall. I know that maybe for the people live streaming it's going to go dark for a minute, but
As you can see, the image of the sea was shot at 5:30 in the morning in Bota, where I evoked to myself that this must have been one of the last images that Tomás saw. I don't know if there are any more questions, but I wanted to mention to you that for the last 2 years I've been working on a new project. And the name of this work will be Tierra, land, where I'm taking pictures of the mass graves throughout Spain. Mass graves throughout Spain. I hope to conclude that work this year and begin to make presentations also. And to conclude, and Mary will allow me, I'd like to thank my daughter, Ona. Ona in Catalan means hola, which is wave. And my husband, Jordan, and who always accompanies me, and without him I wouldn't be here.
I think everybody here knows that there's something interesting in the, you mentioned the Italian bombardments, and you mentioned so people don't necessarily know, for example, that Partito Socialista is the Communist Party, not the Socialist Party. So, and it's specifically Catalan Communist Party, Stalinist. And maybe you'd like to talk about the Italian, why we say that the Italian economy is so on. And this will come up in Brigadistes later as well.
Yo creo que son usadas aquí, pero hay alguna cosa interesante. Usted ha parlato dels bombardejos italians i del PSUV, però molta gent no sap que el PSUV és el partit comunista, no socialista, i que és una variant específicament catalana, no estalinista. I per què és que diem que els italians un tema que tornarà a sorgir durant l'obra de teatre que farem en Mèxic.
No he volgut entrar molt en el tema polític en aquest treball.
Well, I didn't want to get into too much into politics in this
Perquè no volia implicar-me políticament.
because I didn't want to get politically involved.
Jo el que vull és fer últimament referència a aquests fets.
What I want to do is continually make reference to these happenings.
Tot i que la meva posició és totalment antifranquista.
Even if my position is totally anti-Francoist, anti-Franco. I wanted to thank the familiar faces and the faces of friends that I have here. Frances Torres, who is for me a benchmark. Yadra of the Ramon Llull Institute. And my travel mates over these last couple of days here, Laia, Isabel, and Teresa, it's really been a pleasure to be with you in this festival.
This is SANT JORDI, so the first book you might want to buy for someone is Espe's photo book, but there are also all the other books from the festival. You should buy a book and give somebody another. It's part of the celebration. And this really is the definition of fellow travelers, all of you who came from so far to bring you beautiful work. So thank you. it's time to start because there might be people waiting. I'm going to try to project. Thank you again for coming to the SANT JORDI Festival of Books, Roses, and the Arts, and particularly to this presentation of Espe Pons' Under the Light of the Sea, this incredible exhibition that's on the walls here. And that is the staging, the scenography for the play that we're about to, or the stage reading that we're about to see, which is, and yesterday I was talking a little bit about Zeitgeist. Yes, the exhibitions that we're showing came from several different places, but they all had something to do with each other. They all had a space in common. And when I saw the Civil War exhibition and the exhibition about the Balkans, I thought, last semester I translated a book called Brigadistes, Lives for Liberty, which is about the volunteers who flocked to Spain to fight fascism. As one of the biographies, it's 60 thumbnail biographies of people who went from all over the world to Spain. And one of the women who went from the United States, from New York, when she got back to the United States, she got in trouble with McCarthyism, and I don't know, she got in trouble when she got back because they said she was a premature anti-fascist. And going to fight in the Civil War was premature anti-fascism, and so she got in trouble for being a leftist when she got back to the States. But all of those premature anti-fascists saw what was coming. And so tonight we are going to fill up these haunted spaces of the sites of execution and torture of the Civil War with the evocation of the volunteers who went from all over the world to fight against fascism in the Spanish Civil War. So Maria Lipa is the dramaturge who has created a work from what is actually a book of biographies. And she is a professor at Hunter University, and her students are the actors in the play. So please give them
Historian Peter Carroll tells it, the day on which the Abraham Lincoln Battalion first saw combat on the Carama, as enemy planes released some silvery objects, the soldier exclaimed, "They're leaflets." The pamphlets hit the ground faster than expected and set off a chain of explosions that stunned everyone into silence. After a great hush, the soldier commented, "Those were some powerful leaflets." The name of that soldier was Oliver Locke, and he had been a free man for only a few weeks. There was a reason for this. In the United States of the 1930s, a black American could not sit in the same train car as a white American, nor sit at the same table, nor piss in the same bathroom, nor engage in conversation in plain daylight for fear that a cop would arrest him for violating public morality. But strange things happened in the territory of the Republic, such as a company made up of white and black Americans being under the command of the descendants of slaves. The unit was the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, and he was the first African American in history to be the commander of men of all colors, the same man who had commented days before on the notorious launching of the leaflets. He had been a construction worker, and in January 1937, he had arrived on the peninsula wearing the halo of a heroic activist, forged in his long history as a trade unionist in Chicago. In Brunete, he received the order to attack a fascist position that was far too well fortified. He ordered the attack and started out. The commissar, who had shared demonstrations, arrests, and beatings with him in the police stations of Chicago, tried to hold him back. He knew it was hopeless. Oliver Law would not confine himself to watching his men carry out his orders. And after a few brief words, he ran toward his death. And surely as he ran, even as he obeyed an order and a duty that obligated him to run, he continued to be a free man.
Patient Darden was arguing with the Spanish commissar at the hospital, who was of the opinion that women shouldn't smoke because cigarettes were scarce and men were more entitled. When she couldn't get a fresh pack, she would scour the ground searching for butts. 7 butts equaled 1 cigarette. She was once described as a sort of angel, the nurse all the patients wanted by their side, but the person who said it had never seen her in a rage or searching for cigarette butts. Patient Darden kept the cap that nurses wore in England stored inside her suitcase. She considered it a ridiculous and useless artifact in the middle of the war. On the other hand, she would have been thankful for some trousers to make her life easier, so she wouldn't have to run over to a bush and lift her skirt up to her waist several times a day. Once the war was lost, she never mentioned that she had known a German brigadista by the name of Robert Accompanies. Nor did she mention the sorrow that invaded her as she deciphered the feelings that filtered through in his letters, nor their encounters and the obligation to be happy before parting once again, nor the fact that when he died, it was she who wrote his parents. She didn't say a word until 1996, when she was 85 years old and she dared return to the peninsula. She was to receive honorary Spanish citizenship with 600 other brigadistas. But she didn't want to go back to the places where she and Robert Acquis had been together. And a short time after she arrived in Madrid, she died. So we said a happy goodbye, and I climbed into the ambulance. She had ridden a short time after a fleeting meeting with him. Oddly, I kept looking out the window, not noticing anything, and singing at the top of my lungs, wildly happy without knowing why. In Spain, in general, I am happy, except when I am worried about the war, the international situation, and the fascists, who seem to be very strong. Though it is wonderful to have a job from which to fight them. Well, that's a topic for another day. I was ridiculously happy, and I didn't know why.
There, the French government confined thousands of brigadistas who couldn't return to their countries of origin, and a few, not many, who were waiting for their passports. Crowded in there were Germans, Poles, Italians, and volunteers of other nationalities, waiting for the escape networks of the French Communist Party to help them flee. Rita Stewart left behind the comfort of England to help the prisoners of hers in other camps. It was not the first time she had done it. Before the war broke out, she had studied music and and the dramatic arts and had directed theatrical projects for unemployed English workers. She was neither a doctor, nor a nurse, nor an X-ray technician, but she climbed onto an ambulance, traveled to the border, and entered the peninsula as a driver. She worked in a hospital for Bot's refugee children in Murcia, and wrote articles in English to combat the blockade the government had imposed on the Republic. At the end of the war, she helped in the camps for Bot's refugee children, organized musical events to help raise funds, and visited the French camps. Not long after, Hitler invaded Poland, and the curtain was raised in World War II. Frida Stewart, who hadn't budged from France, was arrested by the Gestapo. She was a prisoner of the Nazis for a year until she was able to escape with the aid of the French resistance. She ended the story as she had begun it. In 1936, when she was 26 years old, not long before she had climbed onto that ambulance, she had organized committees in Hull and York to aid the Republic and bring down the blockade. In 1992, when she was a grandmother, she left the comfort of England once again, traveled to Cuba, observed the toll that isolation and the blockade were causing there, and, on a return to Cambridge, at 82 years of age, did the same thing she had done in 1936.
What Mirko Markovich saw when he looked at the map spread out on the table was a chessboard. To open the path for a black pawn, the bishop had to advance and be killed by the white knight. The move was absurd, and it had one problem. The bishop represented all his men. Mirko Markovich was a Serb from Montenegro, but following the death of Oliver Law, he was in charge of the Lincoln-Washington Battalion in the Battle of Brunete. He had been an officer in the Red Army, in the Soviet Union, and a member of the Yugoslavian Communist Party, and he didn't need any lessons in discipline. But after hearing the order from the brigade commandant and transferring it onto the map, he looked at the battalion commissar with a stern expression. Since this man was also from the Balkans, they spoke in Serbo-Croatian. The commandant, who was German, didn't understand a word, but he picked up every syllable, the reproach, in every sharp angle of every word that the unit commander and his commissar aimed at each other. He ordered Mirko Markovich to speak English. There was nothing strange in a brigadistes wanting to know the reason behind an order or questioning what he thought was wrong. But that day, Mirko Markovich did what the laws of every war forbid you to do. He disobeyed the summary order of a superior. He told him that he would not send his men to a death as certain as it was senseless, that he would not carry hundreds of sterile deaths on his shoulders. Then and there, before the table and the map, they relieved him of his command. But disobeying an order in wartime is a crime with a high price. And Mirko Markovich was positioned like a tennis ball wobbling on the net. The ball fell on the right side. He suffered no further punishment, and the general staff decided he had been right. An outcome that could have gone another way. That day, when he placed his life on the net, Mirko Markovich saved many more.
Worked as a nurse in hospitals in Andalusia, Castile, Aragon, and Ebro. When the fascists reached the Aragon defenses, she withdrew with the remains of the Republican army, setting up hospitals out in the open and watching as bombs and tents included flying. She survived. She was saved from the frying pan, but when she got back home, she learned that the fire awaited. The North American Brigadistes had been labeled premature anti-fascists because they had committed the crime of combating fascism without the seal of approval of the government, when the White House had not yet taken an interest in fighting Hitler. Ruth Davidow responded dryly to that accusation. I am not a premature anti-fascist. I have been an anti-fascist all my life. The years to come would confirm it. She defied the persecution of the government and the FBI. She was arrested. With the victory of the Cuban Revolution, she set down command. And in the late 1960s, she volunteered to attend to the activists on the island of Alcatraz, known as Indians of all tribes, who occupied the former prison for 18 months to defend the national rights of Native Americans. But courage does not come all at once. In the midst of the Battle of the Ebro, when the Francoists repelled the Republican attack, she understood that the war could not be won. Ambulances overflowed. The hospital was bombarded. Every morning, it seemed like a miracle that she was still alive. And one day she said, no. She hugged the doctors and nurses, said goodbye to the survivors, and went to the station without anyone's reproach. Who would have dared to criticize her for wanting to protect her life, rather than immolate herself far from home for a lost cause? But this is what happened. The train she was to take stopped at the station, and the stairs to the train car lay before her like a door to salvation. She couldn't move. She was simply incapable of boarding the train.
Ambulance drivers took great risks. In the daytime, they were attacked by Franco's planes, and at night, to avoid attack, they circulated without headlights, accepting the risk of tipping into a ravine or finding themselves in enemy territory. They zigzagged down highways disfigured by bombs, and they moved with great care to avoid jolting that could kill the wounded, and yet fast enough to get them to the hospital alive. What else could add to the anxiety of these drivers? That some of their passengers would jump out of the moving truck and run back to the place where they had picked them up. They were deserters in reverse, who abandoned the places where they ought to be, not to flee from combat, but to return to it. During the Battle of Bota, one of the ambulances that took the wounded to the hospital of Villa Paz was carrying Walter Garland. He didn't jump out of the vehicle, but turned out to be the worst patient the medical team had ever treated. He led a company of machine gunners. He felt responsible for them, and he couldn't bear to find himself lying in bed. Every day, he begged them to let him return to the front, where his men were fighting while he rested between white sheets. None of the doctors would release him, until his wounds had healed and his body had recovered enough to bear up under the harsh conditions of the trenches. The response would be no. The next day, he would ask the same question, morning, noon, and night. And the nurses did what they could to not talk too much with him because they feared that their pleasantries would just be salting the wound. Until one day, the fascist planes strafed the hospital. While the attack was underway, no one paid any attention to Walter Garland's whereabouts, but when the nurses made the rounds in the evening, they found Garland's bed was empty. His and those of 3 other patients. The following day, still wearing their bandages, the 4 deserters greeted the ambulance drivers at the front.
Theo Franco was the son of Castilian immigrant in France, who always felt that his true home was the land of his parents. One August night in 1936, he said goodbye to his mother, crossed the St. Bridge, and boarded a train that would carry him off to work. Sitting by the window, he watched the lights of Bayonne grow small and fixed his eyes on the face of the clock of the cathedral. So that it would be the last thing he saw of the city. That was when he knew that half of his body belonged to the city he saw fading away. At the Madrid front, a short time before entering combat for the first time, his captain pronounced one of the most famous maxims of any war. Don't worry about the bullets you hear. They will not touch you. The bullet coming for you is the one you do not hear. Both the whistle of projectiles that mow friends down and the possibility of being caught by a silent bullet began to multiply. But fate will be happening in a different war. The Germans had readied the weapons and taken aim. An enormous grave gave behind the 35 men, ready to swallow up their bodies. He didn't want the last thing he saw in life to be the soldier who were to kill him. He took his eyes to the sky. Within the blue, he found the face of his mother and the hands of the face of the Cathedral clock. He heard the bullets that killed his mates, but not his own. He fell into the grave like all the dead. The following morning, two farmers realized that among the bodies, an arm was moving. They removed his body and rushed him away to a hiding place. Theo Francos woke up in the house of those farmers. The insignia of his breast, now mangled, had deflected the path of the bullet, which had lodged between his heart and his aorta, in a spot too delicate for any doctor to dare extract. And there it stayed. The bullet that hadn't been whistled will grow all along with him.
Harry Fisher condensed a number of lives into one single life. He was born in an orphanage for Jewish boys. He studied business but lost his job when the crash of '29 devastated the United States. He would wait outside a house where an eviction was going to take place as soon as the police left, leaving the family and their furniture on the street. He and a group of friends would break down the door and put all the furniture back so the family could move back in. He did anything to survive. He worked as a farmer, a bus driver, a merchant marine. None of it wiped away his smile and his gift for sharing stories. During the Battle of Belchite, a strange thing happened. He was pinned down by a mortar shell, and the only thing he could do was hug the ground like a cockroach. His eyes and throat were flooded with sand. The bombs went off just meters away from his flesh, but at some point, he stopped hearing them. His ears closed up. His muscles were made of stone. The world dissolved in dust. His body was an empty box in which the shuddering of the earth resounded. It would be lifted a few centimeters and fall back into the ground, one shock after another, and then he simply fell asleep. But death did not find Harry Fisher sleeping. In March 2003, he was marching in New York in a demonstration against the invasion of Iraq. He was 92 years old. He fainted. A little while later, he was lying in bed in St. Vincent's Hospital. He opened his eyes, asked where he was, and made one last observation. He had already been in that hospital 70 years earlier, when they had sewn up the wounds that the police had inflicted on him during a strike. With this story on his lips, he died. He had been wounded by the police of his own country. He had participated in a war against Franco, Hitler, and Mussolini, and had come out miraculously unscathed, untouched by a bullet or a scrap of shrapnel. Death came to him as he was fighting in the only place where he tended to get hurt.
Maybe Lillian Ernston was destined to be a rebel, because her mother had Roma roots, and her father claimed among his ancestors the illustrious Jack Cade, who, 5 centuries before, had led a revolt against the King of England. But she learned her first real lesson far from her living room at home, when the crisis of the 1930s felled factories and filled the streets with unemployment and hunger. During the Battle of the Ebba, Lillian Ernston served at the Cade Hospital at L'Obispo de Falset, far from the lines of fire where the soldiers had been wounded. She couldn't bear to be far from where she could be most useful, and she fought to be allowed to cross the river and set up a hospital in the Santa Magdalena Hermitage in the Serra de Cavalls. She worked there until the war crushed its walls. The medical staff took shelter in the train tunnels and cliffs. Inside the tunnel, they attended to the wounded in the dark, operating by the light of oil lamps and cigarette lights. When bombs fell on the mountain above them, she shivered. But not out of fear. Fear is to fall alive into the hands of Franco's Moroccan soldiers. When they rushed hospitals, as a rule, they would kill every last wounded man. They tortured, mutilated, and raped the prisoners. During the retreat from Aragon, when the Republicans were stampeding in flight, battle lines disappeared, and no one knew whether the approaching vehicles belonged to enemies or French. An unfamiliar chill engulfed her. She was only able to tell the tale because, as it turned out, the unmarked vehicles that approached them were always friends. Then, the world returned to its original form. The beds, the wounded, the fellow nurses. Their skin was livid, and some were vomiting. Someone asked her, "Lillian, what's going on with your knees?" And she realized they were shaking. Hours later, when the fear had dissipated, her knees continued to shake.
In 1939, a young woman threw red paint on the door of the headquarters of the British government at 10 Downing Street in London. It was a gesture of protest against Chamberlain's non-intervention policy, which had left the Republic unaided and with its hands tied in the face of the tanks and planes of Franco, Hitler, and Mussolini. Her name was Ida Palmer, and she was from Australia. She was a translator and a poet, and she wore her hair short, like a boy. In July 1936, she was in Barcelona with her parents, working on the organization of the People's Olympiad, when the fascists rebelled against the Republic. She saw how the people of Barcelona rose up against the military and crushed them in the streets. The outbreak of the war forced the Palmers to flee to England, but soon, Eileen decided she wanted to return. She broke off her family ties. And since she spoke Spanish, French, Russian, and German fluently, she worked as a translator in a medical unit of the International Brigades. On the front lines, the fruits of Chamberlain's policy pummeled her over and over. Every time an ambulance drove up to the hospital and unloaded dozens of bodies broken by the Italian and German bombs. The clamor of the war pursued her all her life. When she returned to Australia, she realized she didn't have a home. Her parents, two prestigious writers, would never approve of her wanting to be a poet or not behaving as was expected as a young woman. Poems of shame, short hair, flashes of shattered bodies, unrealized desires, and mental illness. None of this could be cured by her parents, or by the laws of society, or the beds in the psychiatric wards, or the electric shock therapies of the Australian institutions. All they did was to turn her memory into a shattered mosaic, through which the sound of the war filtered in thin wires.
crest of the Pyrenees was outlined in the darkness, like a line of insurmountable battlements. Jimmy Yates knew that before the sun peeked out, he would be on the other side, in the Catalonia of the Republic. Others had followed this path before him. 2 generations before, on the day slavery was abolished, his grandmother had danced madly through the streets. But he had grown up in a Mississippi town where every day the dawn revealed black bodies dangling from the branches of the trees. The day he fled for Chicago, he put his cotton factory uniform on over his traveling clothes. "You look fatter every day," his mother had said to him. "You're imagining things," he responded. And he left, without finding the courage to tell her that he would not be home for supper. The soldiers' feet danced on the wet grass. They had been issued as barbenes, hemp sandals, so the sound of their feet wouldn't tip off the patrols of the non-intervention committee that riddled the mountains. He was bathed in sweat, and his legs trembled. He opened his pack and took out one of his 3 books. It didn't matter which one. He left it in the grass. When he had reached Chicago, he was afraid to ease his thirst at a public fountain because in the world he came from, that would mean that the following day, his body would be hanging from a tree. The wind whipped through his clothing. It nipped at the edges of his eyes. It pierced his skin. Each step he took wore him down a little more. He opened his window. He didn't want to look. A second book would have to die so the third could be saved. As a child, to learn to read, he had had to walk 16 kilometers to the school for black children. He had learned each letter sitting on a wooden bench. Every hilltop they climbed heralded the next. They walked down the hills, then up. They tripped. They cried in silence. Their bodies doubled over and gave up. He opened the Bible for the last time. He looked at the book. He saw the poems of Langston Hughes, the poet of London. He ran his fingers around the edges. He chose a stone, and he placed it there with care. He stood back up. The silhouette of the mountain crest appeared against the lilac canvas.
Instead of the most prestigious school in London, she chose a progressive institution where she could be sure no one would punish them for the decision her parents had made. As fate would have it, when she reached the peninsula, they stationed her at the same hospital where her husband was working. It was a former convent in whose chapel she discovered all the preparations for a concert George Green had organized to lift the Christian spirits. He was a musician who would play the cello. A German patient with a limp who would play the violin, even though he only knew how to play by ear. A Catalan patient, also with a limp, would play the banduria, and the hospital plumber would play the guitar. An orphaned accordion waited for the hands that would pick it up. George Green showed Nanny the instrument. "But I don't know how to play it," she exclaimed. "By tonight you'll know," he answered. She had just enough time to learn a few chords and take part in an infernal spectacle performed for the patients. Sometime later, George Green asked to join the British battalion to fight at the front as a soldier. Fate decided he was not to return. Fate, or simple odds, determined that 1 in 3 of the Brigadistes would remain forever in that land. Nan Green worked as a secretary of medical services all over the geography of the world, right down to the river. And just as the nurses did whenever the hospital needed blood, she would lend her arm. She would sit next to the wounded man and observe him. No matter who he was, his skin would be ashen and his lips gray. A thin tube tied their bodies together. Then the device would start sucking at her arm, one gulp after another. And as the blood flowed through the tube and disappeared into the man's body, the gray of his lips mutated into rosy tones. Years later, she would say, it was an experience everyone happened to us.
Photographs of Paula Drexler show an almost girlish smile, like those of many nurses and soldiers captured on the camera in the scarce moments they were neither working nor at the front, contradicting the serious grimaces we take for granted in war photography. She was a secretary in the Military Intelligence Service, and she did nursing duty in hospitals in Vic, Murcia, and Mataró. But Reina Voss didn't like her. She considered her a little inclined to discipline and more concerned with spending time with friends than with working at the frantic speed and rhythm the hospitals require. We should never look at anyone through another's eyes. A report written in March 1940, when the Civil War was already lost, profiled Paula Drexler and Reina Voss would not have recognized. A young woman with scant political preparation and a secretary and nurse committed to fulfilling her duties. We will never know how much truth there was in the report, nor what she thought of it all. We will also never know if one day the war was just too much for her. She had arrived from Austria in February 1937, and she couldn't go home. In 1939, when Franco's troops occupied Catalonia, she crossed the border with the long columns of refugees and with the Brigadistes, who no longer had a home. She managed to escape from the internment camps and join the French resistance. She lived a new life until 19. Two stories have been written of her last day. It matters little whether the Gestapo captured and shot her, or if, on finding herself trapped, she decided to jump out the window.
Dr. Moises Burley didn't know what war was, nor did nurses Irene Golden, Penny Phelps, or Flora Silverman. They thought hard about how to organize a hospital where the wounded would arrive in waves and there wasn't enough space to attend to all of them. They came up with ways to triage the most gravely wounded, and they invented techniques that would save more lives than anyone could have imagined. Moises Burley gave thanks every day. The operating room nurse with whom he worked, Dora Silverman of Wales. On the operating table, no instrument was ever lacking. She had a perfect command of sterilization techniques, and when his strength lagged, she would appear in the operating room with a pitcher of tea full to the brim. She had arrived in August 1936 with the first British volunteers. For her, abandoning the comforts of England had been a natural gesture. She had been a member of the Labour and Communist parties, and while she was studying in Oxford and London, they had called her Dora the Red. During the hunger marches, she had bandaged the blisters on the strikers' feet. That August at Victoria Station, before a cheering multitude that threw flowers at them, both at her and at the men, it had seemed an impossible dream. A few days later, she would be on the peninsula with the Republicans. What would not seem natural was to leave. Renette put the organization and the resistance of nurses and doctors to the test. For almost a month, they fought against time in the triage rooms and the operating rooms and struggled with fatigue and exhaustion. Suddenly, one day, the battle was over. And silence fell upon the hospital. This overwhelmed Thora Silverthorne. When she tried to get up, she couldn't, and she let them carry her home. The doctors and nurses discovered that the war had also wounded them. The wounds were not visible, but their muscles were frayed, and they had lost the desire to speak. They had fallen to the bottom of the well, and voices echoed down from the top of the shaft where the world was hiding.
We ask ourselves how someone can leave behind home, family, work, even peace to go to a distant country where a war is raging. And not just to see the war, but to live it. And we forget an essential question. How does one go back from a world at war to a world at peace? When we make this journey, what pieces of ourselves do we lose along the way? Penny Phelps was wounded by a mortar strike as she attended to soldiers in a hospital in Castellio. She woke up covered in bandages. A doctor came over to her and said that she had been one of the lucky ones. They evacuated her to London, and there, bit by bit, she regained consciousness. The first days, she thought it had all been a dream, or someone else's life. Sometimes she believed that the dream was the world of white hospital walls and the English sun filtering through the window, as if she could not reconcile within one sane being two such conflicting realities. She thought about George Nathan, whose hand she had held as he lay dying in the brunette, and she wondered if he was still alive. When she walked down the streets of her city, if she had heard the sound of an engine in the sky, she ran to take cover in the first doorway she could find. Quite some time would go by before she realized that everyone was looking at her and that bombs would not rain down. Juan Miguel de Mora was from Mexico and fought at the Ebro at the age of 16. He spent one endless week on Hill 666. Where the bombs dropped from a naked sky onto stone and men. He went back to Mexico with an intact body, but a fractured soul. He couldn't make his friends or family understand the shattering in his gut. In a world where everything was just as he had left it, and nothing had been broken, how could a fellow Mexican understand that on that hill, the worst thing was not the bombings, but the minutes of silence that preceded them? How could he explain that void to someone who hadn't experienced it? He had fought at the Ebro, yes, but for many years he was incapable of remembering it. The veil that shrouded the days on the Ebro only lifted when he was 79 years old.
I was very excited decided to work with these actor students from Hunter because they're great, but also because they are the age of most of the people whose lives are portrayed. So I thought that it was very important that this text would be read by people their ages. And I wanted them to connect to the stories. So I had some ideas of the things that I wanted to be present in the reading, but I first asked them to see what stories they resonated with personally. And I pretty much went with what they chose.
And I really was impressed by that aspect. So I do want to ask the actors how they felt, how you responded to the book and to the biographies, and is there anything you'd like to tell us about the experience? And what did you know about the Civil War before doing this?
If I can share, I knew about Franco, I knew the name Franco. I knew that they were one of the fascist brigades in Europe, and they had fought for Republicans, and they had won. But Europe then had a slow transition, Spain had a slow transition back to relative democracy. But there's so much about the story that I didn't know. I know about Guernica, those paintings. It's such a well-painted war. But there's the specific human lives is what's so important about this. And all of the stories of these people are incredibly inspiring and wake you up and remind you of the ever-present threat of fascism. And it keeps you vigilant and keeps you inspired, I would say.
Oh, I'll share something. So I was speaking with Professor Maria about some of the options to pick from in the book. And some things that came to me, I just found it really interesting because actually when my mom was in high school, she went to school in Spain, in Catalonia for a little bit. So I heard her talk about that part of the world. And then also my family, I come from an immigrant background from South America and Guyana. So I just find different stories about how Black people have showed up throughout the world and throughout history to be really interesting. And I didn't really know much about this particular event, but seeing how it really had an impact on people's place in the world and their perspectives and their experience, and how it's all kind of intertwined in really small, intricate ways, which I find really relatable. It was very eye-opening. And even just that last time reading that last story and feeling the weight of the experiences that some of these people were having in context is really moving. So I really appreciate it for that reason.
Yes?
I just wanted to ask you and the people who read, I got the feeling generally that if it were possible to poll these people who were profiled, would you not say that the Spanish Civil War was the defining moment in their lives that affected them for the rest of their lives?
Maybe the densest experience they would have. It's so hard to say.
And because it seemed that the way that the texts were structured, you recount a specific event, but then what they did afterwards, they were always going back to their experience in the Civil War.
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say that it could be if not be even a defining moment in these individuals' lives. When you experiencing war is very harrowing. Of course, it will have this lifelong effect on you. And so many of these stories, we explore themes of trauma and revisiting that throughout your life. And that's something that really resonated with me about the stories that I gravitated towards and the ones that I read, as well as some of the ones that my colleagues were reading.
That as well, it's interesting to look at who they were for as well, and who they are, like the organizers and people who use their gifts, like musicians and theater people and people who speak different languages and poets, and using their gifts for the purpose of activism, which drives them to this and then drives them the rest of their lives. So I think it comes from within as well. People were organizing before they were involved in the Spanish Civil War and continue to do after. And yeah, personally, I really resonated with taking parts of yourself. Anything can be meaningful, and anything can drive you to action.
Thank you for your thoughts and for the beautiful performance. And Maria, thank you for the
invitation, please, and the opportunity to gather here.
That's all. So you might want to buy for give it to somebody for something. The people are outside waiting and there's wine, so I'm going to go open bottles, okay?